Caspian Bridger was the roughest hand in the Wyoming Territory, a man who swore he'd never be tamed. But when a corrupt land baron threatened to burn his family legacy to the ground, Colt was given a choice. Lose everything, or marry the town's old maid, Martha Higgins. He expected a burden. He expected a life of misery with a woman the world had forgotten. What he didn't expect was that the quiet, plain-faced woman standing at the altar hid a dangerous secret and a backbone of steel that would save his life. This is the true story of how a forced marriage became a war for survival. The whiskey in Caspian Bridger's glass was cheap, burning a hole through his stomach, much like the ulcer of debt that had been eating at him for 3 years. Outside the swinging door saloon, the wind howled through the cracked timber of Dust Creek, a town that God seemed to have created on a Monday and forgotten by Tuesday. It was the 14th of October, 1881. Colt stared at the amber liquid, his knuckles white against the glass. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, and handsome in a way that suggested he had been carved out of granite and left out in the rain too long. But right now, he felt like a child. "You're out of time, Bridger." The voice was smooth, cultured, and entirely out of place in the sawdust-covered saloon. Thaddeus Rourke slid into the chair opposite Colt. Rourke was a man who wore silk vests in a town of denim and leather. He owned the bank, the general store, and the sheriff. And as of noon today, he technically owned the Bridger Ranch. Colt didn't look up. "I'll have the money after the drive in spring, Rourke. You know the herd is good." "The herd is sick, Colt. I heard about the fever," Rourke said, flicking a speck of dust from his cuff. "You're done. I foreclose tomorrow. Unless." Colt finally raised his eyes. They were blue, cold, and bloodshot. "Unless what?" Rourke smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "There is a parcel of land adjacent to yours, the Higgins Creek Run. It has the only year-round water source in the valley. I want it. So buy it," Colt spat. "I can't. Old man Higgins died last week. He left it to his daughter, Martha. And the old codger put a stipulation in the will. The land cannot be sold. It can only be transferred through marriage." Rourke leaned in. "She's 34, Colt. An old maid. Spinster. No suitors. She's liable to lose that land to taxes within a year. But I can't wait that long. I need that water for my own herd." Colt felt a sickness rising in his throat. "What are you suggesting?" "You need your mortgage cleared. I need control of the Higgins water. You marry Martha Higgins. You merge the deeds. You sign the water rights over to me. In exchange, I forgive your entire debt. You keep your ranch." Colt slammed the glass down. "You want me to marry a woman just to steal her inheritance? She needs a husband, Colt. She's alone out there." "You'd be doing her a favor," Rourke reasoned, his voice like oil. "She's practical. Plain, but she can cook, I assume. It's a business transaction. Take the deal, or pack your saddlebags and leave the county by sunset." Colt looked around the saloon. He saw the faces of men he'd grown up with, men who would watch him ride out in shame if he lost his father's land. The Bridger Ranch was the only thing that mattered. It was his blood. "Does she know?" Colt asked hoarsely. "I've spoken to her," Rourke lied smoothly. "She is amenable to the arrangement. She knows her situation is precarious." Colt stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. He felt dirty, tarnished. "Have the papers ready at the church tomorrow." He stormed out into the blinding afternoon sun, hating Rourke, but hating himself far more. He didn't know Martha Higgins well. Few did. She was the shadow in the back of the general store, the woman who wore high-collared gray dresses and never spoke unless spoken to. They called her the ghost of Higgins Creek, and now she was to be his wife. The wedding was a funeral for 2 lives. The small wooden church smelled of stale incense and damp wool. There were no guests, only Thaddeus Rourke, his hired gun, a scarred man named Kincaid, and the trembling Pastor Evans. Martha Higgins stood at the altar. Colt hadn't looked at her directly until he was standing 3 feet away. She was not a small woman. She was tall, with shoulders that looked like they had carried heavy buckets for decades. Her hair was a dull brown, pulled back so severely it pulled the skin of her forehead tight. She wore a dress that was clearly her mother's, dated and slightly yellowed with age. Her face was unreadable. She didn't look scared, nor did she look happy. She looked resigned. "Do you, Caspian James Bridger, take this woman?" "I do," Colt grunted, staring at the crucifix on the wall rather than his bride. "And do you, Martha Louise Higgins?" "I do." Her voice was surprisingly low, devoid of the tremor he expected. It was a flat, calm sound. When the ceremony ended, Rourke was there with the papers before the ink in the registry was dry. "Sign here, Mrs. Bridger." Just a formality to consolidate the assets. Colt watched as Martha took the pen. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her dark eyes flicking toward Rourke, then to Colt. She signed, "Martha L. Bridger." Rourke snatched the papers, grinning. "A pleasure doing business. Colt, your mortgage is burned. The water access paperwork will be filed Monday. Congratulations to the happy couple." Rourke left them standing in the dust. Colt walked to his wagon, not offering a hand. Martha climbed up solely, hoisting her single battered trunk into the back. The ride to the Bridger Ranch was 5 miles of silence. The Wyoming landscape was breathtaking, rolling plains crashing into the jagged teeth of the mountains. But the mood in the wagon was suffocating. "I won't lie to you," Colt said finally, keeping his eyes on the mules. "This isn't a love match. I needed the deed cleared. Rourke said you needed protection." "I know what Rourke said," Martha replied. She looked straight ahead. "And I know you didn't want this." "I work long hours," Colt continued, defensive. "The house is a wreck since my ma passed 5 years ago. I don't expect much. Just keep out of my way, and I'll keep out of yours." "Fair enough," she said. When they arrived at the ranch, the reality of Colt's desperation became clear. The fence lines were sagging. The barn roof had a gaping hole. The main house, once the pride of the valley, was gray and peeling. Colt felt a flush of shame. "It's not a palace." Martha climbed down. She walked up the porch steps, testing a rotting board with her boot, and entered the house. Colt followed. The kitchen was piled with unwashed dishes. Dust coated every surface. It smelled of bachelorhood and neglect. He expected her to cry. He expected her to turn around and demand to be taken back to town. Instead, Martha took off her bonnet and placed it on a clean patch of the table. She rolled up the sleeves of her wedding dress. "Where is the well bucket?" she asked. "Out back." "But, go tend your horses, Mr. Bridger," she said, her voice firm. "I'll see what can be done with this." That night, they slept in separate rooms. Colt took the small cot in the study. Martha took the master bedroom. He lay awake, listening to the wind, feeling the weight of the ring on his finger like a shackle. He had saved his ranch, but he felt he had sold his soul. He had married a stranger, a woman he considered an old maid with nothing to offer but land. He had no idea that Martha was awake too, staring at the cracked ceiling, her hand resting on a small, hidden pocket sewn into her petticoat, where she kept the one thing Rourke didn't know she had. 2 weeks passed. The marriage was a series of grunts and passing plates. Colt stayed out on the range from dawn until dusk, driving his small, sickly herd to the upper pastures, trying to avoid the reality of his home life. He expected to come home to nagging or weeping. Instead, he came home to order. It was subtle at first. The dishes were done. The floor was scrubbed so hard the wood grain stood out. Then, the food changed. Colt was used to burning beans and chewing tough jerky. On the 3rd night, he walked in to the smell of roasted rabbit with sage and wild onions. He sat down, dirty and exhausted. Martha placed the plate before him and retreated to the sink. "You catch this?" he asked, mouth full. "Traps," she said simply. "By the creek." "Good," he muttered. It was the most they had spoken in days. The turning point came on a Tuesday. A late-season storm blew in off the peaks, dropping the temperature by 30 degrees in an hour. Sleet hammered the valley. Colt was out in the North Canyon, trying to pull a calf out of a mudslide. His horse, Spook, got spooked by a cracking lightning branch and reared. Colt was thrown hard, his leg twisting beneath him with a sickening crunch. He lay in the mud, rain blinding him, pain radiating from his shin to his teeth. He tried to stand, but the leg collapsed. He was 3 miles from the house. No one knew where he was. I'm going to die here, he thought. Freezing to death in my own mud. He dragged himself toward a rock overhang, shivering violently. Hours passed. The sun began to dip, the light turning gray and hopeless. He closed his eyes, drifting into hypothermia. Crack. A gunshot echoed through the canyon. Colt's eyes fluttered open. Through the sleet, he saw a figure on a horse, not Spook, but an old plow mare from the barn. The rider was wrapped in a heavy oilskin coat, a Winchester rifle resting easily against their shoulder. Mr. Bridger. It was Martha. She rode up to him, dismounting with a surprising agility. She didn't panic. She didn't scream. She knelt beside him, her face wet with rain, her eyes scanning his leg. Broken? She shouted over the wind. Think so, he chattered. How? How did you find me? Spook came back to the barn without you. I tracked the hoof prints. Tracked them? In this rain? Colt couldn't process it. We have to get you up, she said. She didn't ask if he could do it. She grabbed him under the arm. On 3. 1, 2, 3. She was strong. Stronger than she looked. She hauled his dead weight up, groaning with effort, and managed to get him draped over the mare. She didn't mount. She walked, leading the horse through the freezing mud for 3 miles back to the ranch. By the time they got him inside and onto the kitchen table, Colt was delirious with fever. Whiskey, he mumbled. Not for drinking, Martha said. She ripped his pant leg open. The break was bad, but the bone hadn't pierced the skin. This is going to hurt, Caspian. I have to set it. You know how? My father was too cheap for doctors. I did the vetting for our livestock. A bone is a bone. She poured whiskey over the leg, then handed him a leather belt. Bite down. She grabbed his ankle. Her eyes locked onto his. For the first time, he really saw her. There was no fear in those brown eyes. There was a fierce, terrifying competence. Breathe, she commanded. She yanked. Colt blacked out. When he woke, it was morning. He was in the master bed, her bed. His leg was splinted tightly with smooth cedar shingles and wrapped in clean linen. The pain was a dull throb rather than a scream. Martha was sitting in the rocking chair by the window, mending a shirt. She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, but she was composed. Colt tried to sit up. Martha? She looked over. Lie still. The fever broke. But you need rest. You saved my life, he said, the realization hitting him. If she hadn't come, he'd be a frozen corpse in the North Canyon. You're my husband, she said, biting a thread. It wouldn't do to be a widow twice in 1 month. People might talk. It was a joke. A dry, dark joke. Colt stared at her. You tracked me in a storm. You set a leg like a field surgeon. Who are you, Martha? She paused, the needle hovering over the fabric. She looked out the window toward the town of Dust Creek. I'm the woman everyone ignored. Caspian, she said quietly. You learn a lot when people think you're part of the furniture. You learn to listen. Colt looked at the plain woman in the gray dress. Suddenly, she didn't look plain at all. She looked like a fortress. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Rest, she repeated. I have to feed the stock. Since you can't walk, I'm running this ranch until you can. She stood up and walked out. Colt listened to her boots on the floorboards, firm, steady, unwavering. He realized with a jolt that he didn't just owe Rourke money anymore. He owed this woman his life, and he had a sinking feeling that he had severely underestimated the old maid of Higgins Creek. Winter in the Wyoming Territory was not a season. It was a siege. For 3 weeks, Colt Bridger was a prisoner in his own home, bound to the bed and then the fireside chair by the shattered bone in his leg. For a man used to breaking horses and driving cattle, the inactivity was a torture worse than the break itself. but it gave him time to watch. He watched Martha. He watched her wake before the sun, her silhouette moving efficiently through the dim gray light of the kitchen. He watched her pull on his heavy canvas coat, now stained with mud and grease, to go out and break the ice on the water troughs. He watched her haggle with the grain delivery man, her voice low but so steely that the man, a notorious cheat named named Gus, checking against the forbidden list, Gus Miller, actually lowered his price just to get away from her stare. The old maid vanished. In her place, Colt saw a machine of survival. But he also saw something else. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Martha sat nearby, mending a bridle. The firelight caught the curve of her cheek and the loose strands of hair escaping her severe bun. Colt realized, with a sudden, chest-tightening jolt, that she had beautiful hands. They were rough, yes, scarred from work, but they were capable and gentle. "You're staring," Martha said, not looking up. Colt cleared his throat, shifting his bad leg. "I was just thinking. You run this place better than I ever did. You were trying to run a ranch alone, Caspian. No man is an island, though many try to be." She bit the thread. "Why didn't you ever marry, Martha? Before this mess with Rourke?" It was a personal question, one that crossed the invisible line they had drawn. Martha paused. She set the bridle down. "My father was difficult," she said carefully. "He drove suitors away with a shotgun. And after my mother died, he needed a nurse more than a daughter. By the time he passed, I was 34. In Dust Creek, a woman is considered ancient at 25. I became invisible. It was easier that way." "I see you," Colt said. The words hung in the air, heavy and sincere. Martha looked at him, startled. A flush of color rose in her cheeks, making her look 10 years younger. For a moment, the air between them crackled with something that wasn't just gratitude. The moment was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats thundering into the yard. Martha stood up instantly, her face hardening back into stone. "Stay here." "The hell I will," Colt growled. He grabbed his crutch, a makeshift thing Martha had carved from ashwood, and hobbled after her. Outside, 3 riders sat on restless horses. In the center was Thaddeus Rourke, wrapped in a fur-lined coat. Beside him was Kincaid, the gunman with the scar running down his jaw, and a new hired hand Colt didn't recognize. "Evening, Mrs. Bridger," Rourke called out, his voice jovial but his eyes scanning the yard like a hawk. "I heard a rumor in town that our dear Caspian had a nasty fall. Came to pay my respects and discuss the transition." "There is no transition," Martha said, standing on the porch, her arms crossed. "The mortgage is paid. The water rights are shared, as per the contract. You have no business here." Rourke chuckled. Now. A crippled man can't run a ranch, and a woman certainly can't. I have a generous offer. I'll buy the herd now. Save you the trouble of watching them starve over winter. I'll take the land off your hands for a fair price." Colt hobbled out the door, leaning heavily on the crutch, his face pale but furious. "Get off my land, Rourke." Rourke's eyes narrowed. "You look terrible, Colt, like a man with one foot in the grave." Kincaid, the gunman, smirked and rested his hand on his revolver. "Maybe we should help him with the other foot, boss." The threat was naked. Colt was unarmed. His rifle was inside. He tensed, ready to swing the crutch as a weapon. "Mr. Kincaid." Martha's voice cut through the tension like a whip. "I wouldn't reach for that iron if I were you." Kincaid laughed. "And why is that, little lady?" "Because," Martha said, taking a step forward, completely unafraid. "I know about the train job in Abilene, in '76. Silence slammed down on the yard. Kincaid's smile vanished instantly. His hand froze over his gun. Rourke looked at his hired gun, then back to Martha. "What is she babbling about? And you, Mr. Rourke," Martha continued, her voice calm and terrifyingly precise. "You manipulate the ledgers at the bank. You move funds from deceased accounts to cover your gambling debts in Street Louis. I believe the federal marshals would be very interested to see the duplicate books you keep in the false bottom of your safe. The combination is the 18th of April, 2022. Your mother's birthday. Rourke's face went the color of curdled milk. How could you possibly? I cleaned your office for 6 years, Thaddeus, Martha said softly. I dusted your shelves. I emptied your trash. You never noticed me. You spoke on the telephone while I was scrubbing the floor right next to you. You left your safe open because who worries about the invisible cleaning woman? I saw everything. I remember everything. She leaned against the porch railing. Now, ride out. If anything happens to this ranch, to my husband, or to our herd, I write a letter to the marshal in Cheyenne. Do we understand each other? Rourke looked at Martha as if she had turned into a dragon. He was trembling with a mix of rage and genuine fear. He jerked his reins violently. This isn't over, he hissed. Come on. They galloped away into the darkness. Colt stood there, leaning on his crutch, mouth slightly agape. He looked at his wife. She wasn't just a nurse. She wasn't just a cook. The train job in Abilene? Colt asked, stunned. Martha smoothed her apron. I read old newspapers. Kincaid fits the description of the man who robbed the Union Pacific. It was a guess. And the safe combination? That wasn't a guess, she said, a small, dangerous smile touching her lips. I really did read his ledgers. Men like Rourke are sloppy because they think they are untouchable. Colt laughed. It was a rusty sound, but it felt good. Martha Bridger, he said, shaking his head. Remind me never to play poker against you. Come inside, Caspian, she said, her voice softening. It's freezing, but as they turned to go in, Colt saw the tremor in her hands. She had stood up to the devil himself, but the adrenaline was crashing. He reached out and took her hand. It was cold. He squeezed it. You're safe, he said. I've got you. She looked at him, and for the first time, she squeezed back. The victory over Rourke bought them time, but it didn't buy them safety. Winter deepened, turning the ranch into a white wasteland. The dynamic in the house had shifted irrevocably. They were no longer strangers sharing a roof. They were partners in a war. Colt's leg healed slowly. By January, he could put weight on it. By February, he was limping around the barn, helping with the lighter chores. The intimacy between them grew in the quiet moments. It wasn't a sudden explosion of passion, but a slow burn, like coals in a wood stove. It was in the way Martha knew exactly how he took his coffee. Black, 2 spoons of sugar. It was in the way Colt started carving a new cedar chest for her bedroom, working on it late into the night so the sanding wouldn't wake her. One night, a blizzard howled outside, rattling the window panes. The house was drafty, and the cold seeped through the floorboards. Colt was sitting by the fire, reading a book Martha had recommended. She walked in with a heavy quilt. It's going to be a 3-dog night, she said. The wind sounds like a banshee. Colt replied. He watched her. She was wearing a simple nightgown with a thick wool shawl wrapped around her. Her hair was down, cascading over her shoulders in waves. He had never seen her hair down before. It made her look softer, accessible. Martha, he said. She stopped. Yes? Why did you really agree to marry me? She hesitated, looking into the fire. I told you. Rourke. No. Colt interrupted gently. You had dirt on Rourke. You could have blackmailed him into leaving you alone. You didn't need to marry me to save your land. You could have destroyed him months ago. Why did you take the deal? Martha turned to him. Her eyes were vulnerable, stripping away the armor she wore so well. Because I watched you too, Caspian. Colt went still. I used to see you in town, she whispered. When you'd come in for supplies, you were always kind to the horses. You tipped the boy who swept the saloon steps. You were the only man in Dust Creek who never looked through me, even if you didn't really see me. You held the door for me once at the general store, 3 years ago. You tipped your hat. She took a step closer. I didn't marry you for the land. I married you because I thought you were a good man who deserved better than to lose his legacy. Colt's heart hammered against his ribs. He stood up, ignoring the twinge in his leg. He closed the distance between them. I was a blind fool, he murmured, reaching out to touch a strand of her hair. I thought I was stuck with a burden. Instead, I was given the only thing that matters." He leaned in. Martha didn't pull away. She tilted her chin up, her breath hitching. When he kissed her, it wasn't tentative. It was the collision of two lonely souls finally finding their harbor. Her hands came up to clutch the lapels of his shirt. His arms went around her waist, pulling her flush against him. The old maid and the cowboy dissolved into just a man and a woman, holding on to each other against the cold. That night, the door to the master bedroom didn't close between them. But happiness in the West is often the calm before the storm. Spring arrived with a violent thaw. The snow melted into torrents of mud. The Bridger herd, which Martha and Colt had nursed through the winter, was surprisingly healthy. They had lost only 2 calves. With the snow gone, the reality of the cattle drive loomed. They had to move the herd to the railhead in Cheyenne to get the money to fix the barn and buy seed for next year. "I can ride," Colt insisted one morning in April. He was testing his leg. It was stiff, but it held. "You can ride," Martha agreed, "but you can't rope." "Not yet. We need hands, Colt." "No one will work for us," Colt said grimly. "Rourke has threatened every cowhand in the county. If they ride for Bridger, they don't work in this town again." "Then we do it alone," Martha said. "You, me, and the dogs." It was madness. 2 people driving 300 head of cattle over 40 miles of rough terrain. But they had no choice. They set out 3 days later. The days were grueling. Martha rode point, guiding the lead steer, while Colt rode drag, eating the dust and keeping the stragglers moving. At night, they collapsed into their bedrolls, too exhausted to speak, holding hands as they slept under the stars. On the 4th day, they reached the Snake River crossing. The water was high, swollen with snowmelt. It was a dangerous crossing, dark water churning violently. "We have to push them across now," Colt shouted over the roar of the river. "Rain is coming. If we wait, the river will rise higher." They began to drive the cattle into the water. The beasts were reluctant, lowing in fear. Martha rode her mare deep into the current, shouting and waving her hat, forcing the lead animals to swim. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked from the ridge above. Water splashed up violently next to Martha's horse. The mare panicked, rearing up in the deep current. "Martha!" Colt screamed. He looked up toward the ridge. 3 silhouettes. Rourke had not given up. He had waited until they were vulnerable, out in the open wild. Another shot rang out. This time, it hit a steer. The animal thrashed, turning the water red. The scent of blood sent the herd into a frenzy. Martha was thrown from her horse into the freezing, churning water. She surfaced once, gasping, before the current and the panicked hooves of 300 cattle swept her under. "No." Colt spurred Spook, plunging into the river. He didn't care about the gunmen on the ridge. He didn't care about the cattle. He saw his wife's bonnet float downstream, but Martha was gone. Bullets hit the water around him. "You want to fight, Rourke?" Colt roared, a sound torn from the bottom of his soul. He ripped his Winchester from the saddle scabbard. "I'll give you a war." But he couldn't fight and search at the same time. He had to choose. Kill the men on the ridge, or dive into the black water to find the woman who had saved his life. Colt didn't hesitate. He holstered the rifle, took a deep breath, and dove off his horse into the freezing darkness of the Snake River. The Snake River was not merely water. It was a monster of black ice and crushing weight, swollen with the melt of 100 mountain peaks. When Colt Bridger hit the surface, the cold was a physical blow, a hammer strike that seized his muscles and punched the air from his lungs. He kicked downward, fighting the violent churn of the current. His heavy boots felt like lead anchors dragging him toward the silted bottom. The water was murky, a swirling chaos of mud kicked up by 300 panicked cattle. He couldn't see anything. He could only feel the slick, terrifying slide of a passing steer's hide, the bruising impact of a submerged branch, the debris of the chaotic crossing. Martha. The name screamed in his mind, louder than the roar of the water in his ears. He wasn't thinking about the gunmen on the ridge or the cattle. He was thinking about the woman who had pulled him from the snow, the woman who had sat by his bed for weeks. His lungs burned with a fire that demanded he inhale. But he forced himself deeper. His hand brushed something soft fabric. He grabbed it blindly, his stiffening fingers tangling in the heavy wool of a dress. He pulled with every ounce of strength left in his desperate body, kicking toward the faint gray light above. They broke the surface together, gasping. The air tasted of spray and terror. The current was ferocious here, slamming them against the rough bark of a submerged pine log that had snagged on a rock. Colt hooked his arm around it, his muscles screaming as he anchored them both against the rush of the river. Martha was coughing violently, her hair plastered across her face in dark, wet ribbons. Her eyes were wide, wild with shock. But as she looked at him, he saw the recognition. She was alive. Crack. Whiz. A geyser of water erupted inches from Colt's hand, spraying his face. "Down!" Colt roared, shoving Martha's head behind the waterlogged wood. He looked up toward the ridge through the veil of river spray. The three silhouettes were moving. Rourke and his men were riding down the switchback trail, picking their way carefully but quickly toward the riverbank. They weren't satisfied with the chaos. They wanted confirmation. Rourke wanted bodies. "Can you move?" Colt shouted over the river's roar, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Yes," Martha gasped, spitting water. She grimaced as she tried to tread water. "My ankle. I think it's twisted. But I can move. We have to get to the south bank," Colt commanded, scanning the shoreline. "Into the willows. If we stay here, we're sitting ducks." He looked at her, his blue eyes fierce. "Do not let go of me. Never," she whispered. They released the log. The current took them instantly, sweeping them downstream with terrifying speed. Colt held onto Martha's collar with one hand, using his good leg and his free arm to steer them, fighting the river that wanted to smash them against the rocks. They tumbled through a rapid, bruising their bodies against hidden stones, spinning in the white water until the river finally spat them out into a shallow eddy of mud and reeds about a quarter-mile downstream. They crawled onto the mud, collapsing on the bank. The cold was now a second enemy, settling deep into their bones. Colt's hands shook so badly he could barely feel his fingers. He checked his holster. His revolver, the heavy peacemaker, was still there, the leather tie-down holding it in place. He broke the cylinder open. The cartridges were wet, but they were brass-cased center fires. They would fire if the primer held. He had 5 shots. "They're coming," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. She pointed toward the tree line. The sound of hoofbeats squelched in the mud, getting louder. The hunters had reached the river level. "Into the brush," Colt commanded, hauling her up. They scrambled into the dense thicket of willows that lined the river. The mud sucked at their boots, trying to hold them back. Every step was a battle against exhaustion. Colt found a depression behind a massive fallen cottonwood tree, a natural breastwork of rotting timber and root balls. He pushed Martha down into the hollow and crouched beside her. "Here," she said. Colt looked down. Martha was reaching into the sodden folds of her petticoat. Her hands were blue with cold, shaking violently. But she pulled out a small object that gleamed dully in the filtered light, a pearl-handled derringer. 2 shots. Colt stared at her, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "You kept that on you? Through the river?" "I told you," she said, her teeth clattering but her eyes hard as flint. "I learned to survive. A woman alone always has a backup." The sound of horses stopped nearby. Leather creaked. "Split up," came Thaddeus Rourke's voice, echoing through the trees. It was calm, authoritative, and chilling. "Find them. Put 2 in their heads. No witnesses. We claim the herd scattered and they drowned trying to save it." Colt signaled Martha to stay low. He pressed his back against the rotting wood of the cottonwood. Kincaid, the scarred gunman, was riding closest to their position. He was leaning low over his saddle, his gun drawn, his eyes scanning the ground for tracks. He saw the drag marks in the mud where they had crawled up the bank. "Over here, boss," Kincaid yelled, turning his horse toward the fallen tree. "I got sign." Colt rose. He didn't hesitate. He leveled the heavy peacemaker and fired. The boom was deafening in the enclosed space of the willows. Kincaid jerked backward as if kicked by a mule, hit high in the shoulder. He tumbled from his saddle, splashing into the mud. His horse bolted, crashing through the brush. "Colt!" Martha screamed. Thwack! A bullet tore through the bark next to Colt's ear, spraying him with wood chips. The third man, the hired hand, was flanking them from the right. Colt spun, ignoring the screaming pain in his healing leg. He fired 2 rounds in rapid succession. One went wide, cutting through the leaves. The second hit the man's horse in the flank. The beast went down, pinning the rider's leg and sending his rifle flying into the river. But that left Rourke. Thaddeus Rourke was not a cowboy, but he was a desperate man with nothing left to lose. He had dismounted and was moving through the willows on foot, a Winchester rifle in his hands. He knew where they were now. "You can't win, Bridger," Rourke shouted. "I own the law in this county. You die here, and I write the story. A tragic accident." Colt had 2 shots left. He signaled Martha to stay down, his hand pressing firmly on her shoulder for a second before he moved to the left, trying to draw Rourke's fire away from her. Bang! Rourke fired at the movement. The bullet grazed Colt's upper arm, burning like a hot poker. Colt gritted his teeth, suppressing a grunt of pain, and fired back blindly to keep Rourke's head down. 1 shot left. Colt cocked the hammer. He saw Rourke's shadow move behind a screen of brush. He squeezed the trigger. Click. The hammer fell on a bad primer, a misfire. Colt cursed, his heart hammering against his ribs. He cocked it again, desperation clawing at his throat. He fired his last round. Bang! The bullet kicked up dirt at Rourke's feet, missing him by inches. Colt clicked the trigger again. Click, click. He was empty. He crouched, his frozen fingers fumbling for his belt loops. But he realized with a sickening jolt that his spare ammunition was in his saddlebags on Spook. Spook was miles away. Rourke heard the silence. He understood what the hollow clicking meant. He stepped out from behind a willow, stepping over the roots with a triumphant sneer. He leveled his Winchester rifle at Colt's chest. Rourke was smiling, his face twisted with malice and the thrill of victory. "The hero runs dry," Rourke sneered, walking closer. "Fitting. You always were unprepared for the real world, Caspian. Goodbye." He began to squeeze the trigger. Colt braced himself, preparing to launch his body at the man in a futile attempt to shield Martha. Pop, pop. 2 small, sharp cracks like the snapping of dry twigs rang out. Rourke froze. A look of utter confusion washed over his face. A red stain blossomed on the front of his white shirt, right over his heart. He looked down at it, uncomprehending, then looked past Colt. Martha was standing there. She had risen from the mud like an avenging spirit. She held the tiny pearl-handled derringer in both hands to steady her aim, smoke curling lazily from the short barrels. She wasn't shaking anymore. Her face was a mask of cold, absolute resolve. Rourke dropped to his knees. His rifle fell into the mud. He looked up at the old maid he had tried to exploit, the woman he had called invisible, the woman he had underestimated every day of his life. "You." Rourke wheezed, blood bubbling at his lips. "I'm Mrs. Bridger," Martha said, her voice cutting through the ringing silence. Rourke fell face forward into the mud and did not move again. Colt stood frozen, staring at the body, then slowly turned to his wife. She stood there for a heartbeat longer, the empty gun still raised, before her arms dropped. The adrenaline broke, and she swayed. Colt crossed the distance in 2 strides. He caught her as she collapsed, pulling her into his arms. She buried her face in his wet coat, sobbing violent, racking sobs that shook her entire frame. "It's over," Colt whispered into her wet hair, holding her so tight he thought he might crack a rib. "It's finally over, Martha. You did it." The river rushed on nearby, indifferent to the violence. But in the quiet of the willows, the war for the Bridger Ranch had ended not with a cowboy's gun, but with the fierce courage of the woman who stood beside him. The silence that followed the gunfire at Snake River was heavier than the roar of the water. It was the silence of a storm finally breaking, leaving the air clear but trembling. The aftermath was not a celebration. It was a grueling test of endurance. Colt and Martha did not ride immediately back to civilization. They couldn't. They were battered, soaked to the bone and shivering from the adrenaline crash. But there was work to be done. They spent the next hour in a grim quiet, burying Thaddeus Rourke. It was Colt who insisted on it. "We aren't animals," he had said, his voice raspy as he turned the wet earth with a spade found in his saddlebags. Martha watched him from the shelter of the willows, her face pale but composed. Even after everything Rourke had done, the extortion, the threats, the attempt on their lives, Colt Bridger would not leave a man to the coyotes. It was that moment, perhaps more than the gunfight itself, that solidified the respect Martha held for him. He was a man of honor in a lawless land. Finding the herd took 2 agonizing days. The cattle had scattered into the brush, spooked by the blood in the water. Colt and Martha worked until their muscles screamed, riding through mud and scrub oak, sleeping in their wet clothes under the open sky. They shared the last of their jerky, breaking the tough strips in half and eating in a companionable silence that felt more intimate than any conversation they had ever shared. They moved no longer as a cowboy and a burden, but as a single, efficient unit. When they finally drove the 300 head of cattle into the Cheyenne stockyards, they looked like ghosts. Their clothes were torn and stained with river mud. Colt was limping heavily, and Martha's face was gaunt with exhaustion. The stockyard hands stared openly at the ragged pair, but the cattle told a different story. Despite the drive, the Bridger herd was the finest to hit the rails that season, fat, healthy, and sleek. The buyer, a skepticism-hardened man named Mr. Henderson, looked the animals over, then looked at the disheveled couple. "I heard Bridger was finished," Henderson muttered, chewing on a matchstick. "Heard the fever took his stock." "You heard wrong," Colt said, leaning on his saddle horn. He looked at Martha, who sat straight-backed on her mare, her chin held high despite her tattered dress. "We managed." Henderson named a price. It was high. The market was starving for beef, and the winter blizzards had decimated other herds. When Henderson scribbled out the bank draft, he held it out toward Colt. Colt didn't move to take it. He nodded toward the woman beside him. "Make it out to Martha Bridger," Colt said firmly. Henderson paused, his pen hovering. He looked at the woman, then back to the cowboy. "To the wife?" "That's a regular, son. To the partner," Colt corrected, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She's the reason this herd is standing here. Put her name on it." Martha's eyes widened slightly as she took the paper. She looked at the sum, then at Colt. For the first time in her life, she held the tangible weight of her own labor and worth in her hands. They didn't rush home. They stayed in Cheyenne for 2 days, sleeping in a real hotel, bathing in hot water, and buying clothes that weren't stiff with grime. They bought a new wagon, hitching Spook and the mare to the back, and filled the bed with supplies: window, glass, paint, seed, and flour. The return to Dust Creek was a victory parade of 2. They stopped first at the sheriff's office. The town went quiet as they walked in. Martha placed the ledger she had kept hidden for years onto the sheriff's desk. It was a dense book, filled with the damning arithmetic of Rourke's embezzlement. "You'll find everything there," Martha told the stunned lawman. "Dates, amounts, and the account numbers he used to hide the stolen funds. Call the federal marshals." With Rourke dead and the evidence laid bare, the shadow that had hung over the valley evaporated. The fear was gone. The ghost of Higgins Creek had exorcised the town's demon, but the true transformation happened 5 miles out of town, at the Bridger Ranch. Summer bled into a golden autumn. The ranch, once a gray, peeling monument to bachelor neglect, began to breathe again. The barn roof was repaired. The corrals were reinforced with new timber, and the house gleamed with a fresh coat of white paint. It was a warm evening in late August when Colt sat on the porch swing, watching the sun dip below the purple hills. The air smelled of sagebrush and cooling earth. He rubbed his bad leg absently. The ache was there, a reminder of the winter, but it was a manageable pain now. The screen door creaked. Martha stepped out. She was wearing a new dress of deep cornflower blue that matched the summer sky, the fabric soft against her skin. Her hair was no longer pulled back in that severe, painful bun. It hung loose in waves around her shoulders, softening the sharp angles of her face. She carried a pitcher of lemonade and 2 glasses. She didn't look like the old maid the town had pitied. She looked like a queen surveying her kingdom. She poured a glass and handed it to him, then sat beside him on the swing. The chains groaned softly as they settled. "The corn is coming up high," she noted, looking out at the field they had planted together. "High enough to hide a horse," Colt agreed. He took a sip. It was sweet, cold, and perfect. "We'll have a good harvest this year. Better than my father ever saw." "We worked hard for it," Martha said simply. Colt set the glass down on the railing. He turned to look at her. The golden hour light caught the stray strands of her hair, turning them to copper. His chest tightened with a feeling that scared him more than Rourke's gun ever had. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small, black velvet box. He had bought it in Cheyenne with the very last of the cattle money, hiding it in the grain sack so she wouldn't find it on the ride home. "Martha," he said, his voice dropping an octave. She stopped rocking the swing. She looked at the box, then up at his eyes. "Caspian? What is this?" "I gave you a ring in that church because Rourke made me," Colt said, his voice thick with emotion he had never learned to express. It was a contract, a shackle. It was a lie told to save a piece of land. He opened the box. Inside nestled a silver band, far finer than the plain brass loop she currently wore. It was engraved with intricate, tangling vines of ivy, strong, enduring, and impossible to break. "I want to give you this one," Colt whispered, taking her rough, scarred hand in his. "Because I choose you. Not for the water rights, not for the cooking, not because I need a nurse." He looked deep into her dark eyes, stripping away the last of his defenses. "I choose you because you are the bravest woman I have ever known. Because you saved me in every way a man can be saved. And because I love you, Martha." Martha stared at the ring, her breath hitching in her throat. The tears came silently this time, not born of sorrow or fear, but of a joy so profound it washed away decades of being invisible. "Put it on me, cowboy," she whispered, her voice trembling. Colt slid the brass ring off and replaced it with the silver ivy. It fit perfectly. He leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was slow, tasting of lemonade and promises kept. They sat there as the first stars pricked the violet sky over Wyoming, the old maid and the cowboy, holding hands on the porch of the home they had fought for, bled for, and saved together. The world had tried to break them. Instead, the fire had forged them into something unbreakable. And as the night settled over the valley, Colt Bridger knew that the richest man in the territory wasn't the one with the biggest bank account, but the one holding Martha Bridger's hand. The legend of Caspian and Martha Bridger reminds us that true strength isn't always found in the loudest voice or the fastest gun. It is often found in the quiet resolve of those who have been underestimated. Martha Higgins was cast aside by society, labeled an old maid and forgotten. But beneath that plain exterior was a warrior who saved her husband not just from financial ruin, but from death itself. Their marriage, born of corruption and force, blossomed into a partnership of equals, proving that love built on respect and shared survival is the strongest bond of all. In the end, the woman who was invisible became the most essential part of Colt Bridger's life, teaching him and us that sometimes the greatest treasure isn't the land you own, but the hand you hold. Thank you for watching this story of the Wild West. If Martha's courage inspired you, or if you believe that true love can be found in the darkest of places, please hit that like button to help us share this story. Don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder to never give up. And subscribe to our channel for more incredible true-to-life tales of romance, grit, and survival on the frontier. What would you have done in Martha's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.